In the year 1050, on the windswept island of Öland off the coast of Sweden, a man was laid to rest. This was not a new Christian burial. It was something older. The man was placed in his grave at a place called Klinta. He was old when he died, maybe 60. His body was arranged carefully, but it was the things buried with him that told his story. Beside him was a long iron staff. It was topped with a bronze case, and inside that case were pieces of an even older, decorated staff. Amulets and charms hung from it. One was a small pouch containing the bones of a polecat. Another held a shard of glass. Near his feet lay the complete skeleton of a bear, its skin and head still intact. It was placed there as a powerful guardian for his journey. This man was not a king. He was not a famous warrior. The people who buried him in a land that was officially becoming Christian believed he had a different kind of power. He was likely a side mod or a sorcerer or a practitioner of the old magic. His grave was a defiant act. It happened during a time when stone churches were being built just a few miles away. It was a statement that the old ways, the old gods, and the old fears were not gone. They were just beneath the surface. This burial, with its 200 amulets and animal sacrifice, happened during the lifetime of the final generation of pagan Vikings. It is one of the last and clearest messages they sent us. Their world was ending, but they would not let it go quietly. Their secrets were buried with them in graves like the one at Klinta, waiting for us to uncover them. Number 15, some kings chose the old gods over a crown. His name was Sweyn, but history remembers him as Blot-Sweyn. The name tells you everything you need to know. A blot was a Norse pagan sacrifice. To be called Blot-Sweyn was like being called Sweyn the Sacrificer. He was the man who brought the old rituals back to the heart of Sweden, if only for a short time. This happened around the year 1084, and Sweden was in turmoil. The old faith and the new one were fighting for control, not just in the villages, but in the royal family itself. The king at the time was Inge the Elder. Inge was a Christian, and he was a zealous one. He wanted to do what other kings across Scandinavia had done. He wanted to make his kingdom fully Christian. This meant ending the traditional sacrifices at the great temple in Uppsala. For centuries, Uppsala was the center of the Norse pagan faith in Sweden. Every 9 years, a huge festival was held there. People from all over the country came to feast and make offerings to the gods. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing a few years earlier, described it in stark terms. He wrote of a golden temple and sacrifices of both animals and humans hanging from the trees in a sacred grove. Whether his account was exaggerated or not, Uppsala was hugely important. King Inge decided this had to stop. He declared that all Swedes must be baptized, and he tried to abolish the sacrifices at Uppsala. This was a direct attack on the identity of many of his most powerful chieftains and free farmers. They saw it as an attack on the traditions that held their world together. The gods of their ancestors were not just stories. They were active forces. You made offerings to Thor for protection, to Frey for a good harvest. To stop these rituals was to risk famine, defeat, and chaos. It was an unthinkable risk, so the Swedes at the assembly, the thing, gave King Inge a choice. He could either respect the old ways and lead the blot himself, or he could give up the throne. Inge refused. He was a Christian king. He would not make a sacrifice to pagan gods. For this refusal, the assembly renounced him. According to legend, they threw stones at him as he left, shouting their disapproval. Inge was forced into exile, retreating to the more Christianized province of Västergötland. The people needed a king who would perform the rituals. They turned to Inge's brother-in-law, Sweyn. Sweyn was willing. He rode to the assembly and made them a promise. If they made him king, he would restore the sacrifices. He would lead the blot. The deal was struck. Sweyn rode to Uppsala, and it is said he drank the blood of the sacrificial animals, or at least presided over the ceremony. He became Blot-Sweyn, the pagan king. For about 3 years, from 1084 to 1087, paganism was officially restored in Sweden. The Blot-Sweyn ruled from Uppsala. It was the last great pagan revival in Scandinavia. It was a direct political rejection of Christianity led by a king. But it was not to last. Inge the Elder was in exile, but he was not defeated. He was gathering his strength, waiting for his moment. In the winter of 1087, Inge and his followers marched secretly from Västergötland. They traveled quickly under the cover of darkness and surrounded the royal estate where Blot-Sweyn was staying near Uppsala. They set the hall on fire. As Blot-Sweyn and his men ran out of the burning building, they were cut down. The pagan king was killed. Inge the Elder retook the throne. After that, the resistance was broken. Inge moved to destroy the temple at Uppsala once and for all. He reportedly burned it to the ground and built a church on the site. The story of Blot-Sweyn is the story of the final organized resistance. You know, it wasn't just a few old people in a village clinging to superstitions. This was a political movement, powerful enough to depose one king and crown another. It shows that in the late 11th century, 100 years after Denmark had officially become Christian, the pagan faith was still strong enough to be the central issue of a civil war. For a man like Blot-Sweyn, being the king who upheld the old ways was more important than accepting the new faith, even if it meant a violent death. He was the last pagan king to rule in Sweden, and his short, dramatic reign was the final stand of the old gods in the halls of power. Number 14, their most sacred place was a real building. For a long time, people wondered if the great pagan temples described in the sagas were real, or were they just literary inventions created by later Christian writers to make the pagans seem more organized, more like a rival church? The temple at Uppsala in Sweden was the most famous of all. A German churchman named Adam of Bremen wrote about it around 1070. He had never seen it himself. He was reporting what he had heard from others, including the Danish king. But his description was vivid. He wrote of a golden temple where the people worshipped statues of their three main gods. Thor was in the middle, the most powerful. Odin and Frey were on either side. He described a great festival held every 9 years where 9 males of every living creature were sacrificed. Their bodies were hung from the trees in a sacred grove next to the temple. The songs sung during these rituals, he said, were so unseemly that it was best not to repeat them. For years, this account was seen with skepticism. It sounded too much like anti-pagan propaganda. A golden temple or human sacrifice on a mass scale. It seemed too dramatic to be true. Then came the archaeologists in the 1920s, and then with more advanced technology in the decades that followed, they began to excavate the ground around the old church at Gamla Uppsala, the very spot where the temple was said to have stood. They did not find a golden temple. That was probably an exaggeration, maybe a reference to a roof made of gilded shingles that shone in the sun. But they did find something that changed everything. They found evidence of a massive building beneath the current church, which was built around 1130. They discovered the post holes of an enormous wooden structure. These were not just ordinary post holes. They were huge, indicating that the posts they held were tree trunks, massive pillars that supported a very large hall. The building was dated to the Viking Age. Further excavations revealed a series of these halls, built one on top of the other over centuries. The last one was the biggest and grandest. It was the one that stood in the final years of the pagan era. They also found evidence of immense ritual activity. The soil was thick with animal bones, many of them from horses, cattle, and pigs. These bones showed signs of feasting on a huge scale. This matched the saga accounts of people gathering for great sacrificial meals, or blots, where the meat of the sacrificed animals was cooked and eaten. They found layers of ash and burned material, signs of countless fires. The location itself was significant. The hall was built right next to 3 enormous royal burial mounds, which date back to the 6th century, long before the Viking Age. This meant the Viking Age temple was deliberately placed in a landscape that was already ancient and sacred. It was a way of connecting the current rulers and their gods to the legendary kings of the past. It was a center of both religious and political power. So while Adam of Bremen might have gotten some details wrong or sensationalized his account, he was right about the most important thing. There really was a great temple at Uppsala. It was a real physical place. It was the heart of the Svir people's religious life. The discovery of its foundations proves that organized Norse paganism was not just a collection of small local cults. It had major centers, impressive architecture, and large-scale, long-lasting rituals. The man who lived near Uppsala around the year 1050 would have known this building. He might have traveled there for the great festivals, he would have seen the chieftains and the king gather, he would have smelled the smoke from the cooking pits and heard the chanting. For him, the temple was not a myth. It was a solid, imposing structure, the house of the gods on earth. And when King Inge the Elder finally destroyed it around 1087, it was not just the end of a tradition. It was the physical destruction of their most sacred place. The new church was built on its ashes, a clear and deliberate message that a new power had taken over. Number 13, they wrote poetry for the dead and asked Thor to protect it. On the island of Öland, the same Swedish island where the Klinta sorcerer was buried, stands a tall, thin stone. It is called the Karlevi runestone. It is one of the most remarkable runestones in the entire Viking world. It was carved around the year 1000, right in the middle of the transition period. The man it commemorates was a chieftain named Sibbi the Good, son of Fuldar. But the stone is famous not for who it honors, but for how it does so. The inscription is partly in prose and partly in verse. The prose part is straightforward. It says that the stone was raised in memory of Sibbi, but the verse is a different matter. It is a complete stanza of a complex form of skaldic poetry called Druktvat. This was the poetry of the royal courts. It was notoriously difficult to compose with a strict syllable count and a complex pattern of internal rhymes and alliteration. To create a Drottgavat stanza was the work of a highly skilled poet, a skald. The poem on the Karlevi stone is a powerful piece of pagan verse. A rough translation reads, "Here lies a chieftain who, as the land guardian of the war band, the end bringer of the giantess's kin, controlled the land of Denmark. No truer battle tree, a mighty warrior will rule the land." The language is dense with kennings, the classic Norse poetic metaphors. Land guardian of the warband means chieftain. End bringer of the giantess's kin is a kenning for a warrior, a killer of monsters. Battle tree is a kenning for a warrior. This is high art. It is a public declaration of Sibbi's status and a masterpiece of the poet's craft. This alone would make the stone special. It shows the sophistication of the art form in this late period, but there is another smaller inscription on the stone. On the reverse side, away from the main text, is a short, simple line carved in a different style of runes. It says, "Thor Vigi," or "May Thor hallow." This changes everything. The stone is not just a memorial. It is a sacred object. The carver, after finishing his masterpiece of poetry and runic carving, added a final invocation to one of the most powerful of the old gods. He was asking Thor to protect the stone, to consecrate it, to give it power. This was happening at a time when Christian missionaries were active all over Scandinavia. The idea of a single, all-powerful god was spreading, yet here a poet and his patrons chose to entrust their memorial to Thor. The story of the stone is the story of the men who created it. We can imagine the scene. A chieftain named Sibbi has died. He was a Dane, perhaps a leader of the legendary Vikings, who was active on the southern Baltic coast. His followers, his warband, want to honor him in the grandest way they know how. They hire a master poet, a skald. This poet is a professional, a keeper of the old traditions and the complex language of the court. He composes the verse, a fitting tribute to a great warrior. Then a rune master carves it into the stone. The work is difficult and precise, and when it is all done, they perform one final act. They ask for the protection of the god of thunder, the defender of gods and men. This was not a passive act of culture. It was an active religious choice. They could have added a cross, as many runestones from this period did. They chose not to. They chose Thor. The Carlevi Stone is a snapshot of a world where pagan belief, high art, and social status were completely intertwined. It tells us that for a warrior elite around the year 1000, the old gods were not fading figures of folklore. They were still the powers you called upon to protect the memory of your greatest leaders. The stone still stands today, a testament to Sibi's life, the poet's skill, and Thor's enduring power in the minds of the last pagan generation. Number 12, magic was a woman's profession. In the year 980, near the Great Ring Fortress of Firkat in Denmark, a woman of high status died. Her burial was one of the most extraordinary ever found from the Viking Age. She was not buried with the usual signs of female wealth, like keys to the household or large amounts of jewelry. Instead, she was buried with the tools of her trade. She was a vulva, a seeress, a practitioner of Scyther, the most powerful form of Norse magic. The grave, known as Firkat IV, was discovered by archaeologists in the 1950s. The woman was buried in a wagon body, a symbol of high rank and travel. She was dressed in a fine blue and red dress with threads of gold woven into the fabric. She wore toe rings, a rare find. But it was the objects with her that revealed her identity. She held a long iron staff with a bronze knob at the top. This was her Valor, the staff that gave the vulva her name. It was not a weapon, it was an instrument of magic. The sagas describe seeresses using staffs like this to help them enter a trance and see the future. Around her waist was a leather pouch. Inside was a collection of strange items. There was the pellet of an owl containing the tiny bones of mice and shrews. There was the tail of a stoat. There were various animal bones, and most importantly, there were the seeds of henbane. And henbane is a plant in the nightshade family. It is a powerful hallucinogen and poison. If consumed even in small amounts, it can cause delirium, visions, and a feeling of flying. This was almost certainly part of her ritual kit, a tool to help her and perhaps others achieve an altered state of consciousness to communicate with the spirit world. Her other items in the grave pointed to her special role. She had a small silver amulet shaped like a chair. This might represent the high seat from which a seeress would perform her prophecies, as described in the saga of Eric the Red. She also had exotic items, including a bronze bowl from Central Asia, showing she was part of a world of long-distance connections. The Firkat vulva tells us that magic was a real and respected profession in the late 10th century. This was not a village healer with a few folk remedies. This was a specialist. Her rich burial inside a royal fortress shows she was patronized by the highest levels of society. A king or a great chieftain wanted this woman near him. He would have relied on her for advice, for predictions about the coming harvest or the outcome of a battle. Her power was a crucial part of his power. The practice of cider was complex. It was considered unmanly for men to perform it, though some did. It was primarily a female domain. The vulva was a figure of both immense respect and fear. She could travel in spirit, change shape, control the weather, and see what was hidden. The story of the Firkat woman is the story of a professional life. She would have been sought out by people for help with everything from finding lost objects to curing illness to cursing an enemy. She would have undergone a long apprenticeship to learn her craft, to understand the plants, the chants, and the rituals. Her burial in 980 took place just as King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from the nearby Jelling, was declaring that he had made the Danes Christian. But the vulva's grave shows that even as the king was erecting his great Christian runestone, the old powers were still being consulted within the walls of his own fortresses. For the people of that time, Christianity might be the new official religion, but when it came to the truly important questions of fate and fortune, you still went to see the woman with the iron staff and the bag of henbane seeds. She held the secrets of the old world, and her power was still very real. Number 11, Christian kings had to pretend to be pagan. The story of King Haakon the Good of Norway is a perfect example of how deeply the old ways were embedded in society. Haakon became king around the year 934. He had been raised in England at the court of King Athelstan, or he was a baptized Christian. When he returned to Norway to claim the throne, he brought his new faith with him, and he wanted to convert his people. But his people were not ready. The Norse historian Snorri Sturluson tells the story in his saga collection, the Heimskringla, written a couple of hundred years later but based on older poems and stories. Snorri describes how Hakon tried to persuade the people to accept Christianity. He suggested they stop their sacrifices to the old gods. He asked them to worship the one god and to rest on the seventh day. This did not go well. The free farmers and local chieftains who made up the Norwegian assemblies were powerful. The king did not have absolute authority. He ruled with the consent of his people, and his people were deeply traditional. At an assembly in Trondelag, a powerful region in central Norway, the farmers pushed back. A spokesman stood up and spoke to the king. He reminded Hakon that they had chosen him as their king on the condition that he would uphold their laws and traditions. And the most important tradition was the blot, the sacrifice. They told him that they depended on the gods for good harvests and peace. They insisted that the king must participate in the sacrificial feasts, as all kings before him had done. The pressure was immense. If Hakon refused, he would lose their support. He would lose his kingdom. Snorri describes a specific feast where things came to a head. A great blot was being held. As part of the ritual, horse meat was cooked and eaten, and its blood was sprinkled on the altars and the people. A toast was then drunk to the gods. The first cup was for Odin, for victory, and the king's power. The second was for Njord and Frey, for a good harvest and peace. Hakon, as a Christian, could not eat horse meat. He could not drink a toast to pagan gods. When the drinking horns came to him, he made the sign of the cross over his cup instead of the sign of the hammer of Thor. The chieftains were angry. What is the king doing? They asked. One of his allies, a powerful earl named Sigurd, tried to smooth things over. He told the men that the king was simply making the sign of the hammer, not the cross. He was blessing the cup in the name of Thor. This calmed them down for a while, but at the next feast the pressure was even greater. The farmers insisted he eat the horse meat. He refused. They insisted he at least drink the soup from the horse meat cauldron. He refused. They insisted he at least touch the fat from the meat. He still refused. The chieftains became furious. They threatened to abandon him. Finally, Earl Sigurd persuaded the king to compromise. Hakon agreed to hold his mouth over the handle of the cauldron, where the smoke from the horse meat had condensed. He didn't eat it, but he went through the motion. Neither side was happy, but it was enough to prevent open rebellion. This story, even if dramatized by Snorri, reveals a crucial truth. In the 10th century, a king's personal faith was secondary to his public duty. And that duty was to be the religious leader of his people. Hakon the Good was a Christian, but to rule Norway, he had to act like a pagan. He had to participate, however reluctantly, in the rituals that his people believed held their world together. The final generation of pagans, a century later, would have heard stories like this. They would have known that the conversion of Scandinavia was not a simple, straightforward process. It was a messy, political struggle where even kings had to bow to the power of tradition. The old gods did not let go of their kings easily. Number 10, some people mark the exact year of their conversion. In a churchyard on the small island of Cooley, off the coast of western Norway, stands a stone that gives us a uniquely personal look into the religious changes of the Viking Age. It is not large or ornate. It is a simple, slender stone, about 2 meters tall. But the runes carved on its side carry one of the most direct and powerful messages from this period of transition. The Cooley stone is dated to around the year 1034. The inscription is short. It reads, "Thor and Halvard raised this stone in memory of Ulv. 12 winters had Christianity been in Norway." That last phrase is what makes this stone so incredible. Tolvvetter hafdi Kristendomer verit I Noregi. It is a precise statement of time. It tells us that when this stone was raised, the new faith had been the official law of the land for exactly 12 years. The event this likely refers to is the assembly of Moster in 1024, when King Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, and his bishop made Christianity the one and only legal religion in Norway. This law formally banned all pagan worship. The stone was raised by two men, Thor and Halvard, for a man named Ulv. We do not know who these men were. They were probably local farmers or landowners. Ulv may have been their father or another close relative. But we know what was on their minds when they put up this memorial. They were living in a new era. The world they had been born into was gone. The old ways were now illegal. They were marking their family's place in this new timeline. Their private grief for Ulv is tied to a huge public event. Imagine being Thor or Halvard. You are probably in your 30s or 40s. For the first part of your life, the old traditions were still alive. You would have seen people make offerings at sacred groves or on holy white stones, which were common in this part of Norway. You would have heard the stories of Thor and Odin. The calendar was marked by the old feasts for planting and for harvest for the winter solstice. Then, just 12 years ago, everything changed. The king declared that all this was to stop. You had to be baptized. You had to go to church. You had to be buried in consecrated ground. Your children were being taught a new set of stories about a man named Jesus who was the son of a single, all-powerful God. The old gods were now called demons. When your kinsman Ulv died, you decided to raise a runestone for him. This was an old tradition, a way of honoring the dead that went back centuries, but you added something new. On one side of the stone, you carved a large cross. This was the symbol of the new faith, a public declaration that you and your family were now Christian. On the other side, you carved the runes, and in that inscription, you marked the time. 12, winter. It feels like a statement of fact, but it is also deeply personal. It is like saying, we are living in year 12 of the new world. It suggests that the change was so significant, so life-altering, that people were counting the years from the moment it happened. It was their year zero. The Cooley Stone is sometimes called Norway's birth certificate because it is the first time the name Norway Norregi is found written down within the country itself. But it is also the birth certificate of Christian Norway, and it is a death certificate for the old ways. It tells us that for the people who lived through this change, the conversion was not a slow, gradual process they barely noticed. It was a specific event. It happened in a specific year. And 12 years later, it was still the most important thing that had ever happened to their country, so important that they carved it in stone to mark a family member's grave. It is the voice of an ordinary person, telling us exactly when his world changed forever. On number 9, their symbols of power were not weapons. In 1822, a man digging a drain in a field at Seaton Carew, in the northeast of England, found a strange object. It was a long, slender stone bar, about 40 centimeters in length. It was made of whetstone, the kind of stone used for sharpening blades. But this was no ordinary tool. It was intricately carved. At one end was a fully sculpted human head with a neat beard and mustache. At the other end was a more simplified, almost animal-like head. The stone itself showed almost no signs of use. It had never been used to sharpen a sword or an axe. Its edges were crisp and its surface was polished. The object, which became known as the Seaton Carew whetstone, was a puzzle for a long time. It dated to the Viking Age, a time when this part of England was under Scandinavian control as part of the Danelaw. But what was it for? Why create such a beautiful, elaborate object that seemed to have no practical function? The answer is that its function was not practical. It was symbolic. This was not a tool. It was a scepter. It was a symbol of a lord's authority, his right to rule and to dispense justice. We know this from looking at other similar finds and from reading the old poems and law codes. In the Norse world, a king or a chieftain had several key roles. He was a war leader, but he was also a judge and a religious figure. He was the one who upheld the law and kept the peace within his own community. A whetstone was a perfect symbol for this. A good whetstone makes a blade sharp and effective. A good king sharpens his people. He makes the law clear and effective. He maintains order. The Eddic poem Havamal contains advice for a wise man. and one verse speaks of the need to be a whetstone of a man. The whetstone scepter was a physical representation of this idea. Holding it was a way of showing that you were the source of justice and good governance. The man who owned the Seton Carew whetstone in the 9th or 10th century was likely a local Scandinavian lord. He might have been a Viking who had settled in England after a period of raiding, or the son of one. He was a man of power in his community. He would have presided over the local assembly or thing. He would have listened to disputes over land theft or insult. He would have passed judgment. When he held this scepter, he was not just holding a fancy rock, he was holding his authority in his hand. The carved heads on the scepter may have represented ancestors or even gods, adding a supernatural weight to his judgments. It was a pagan symbol of power. It had nothing to do with a Christian cross or a bishop's crozier. Its meaning was rooted in the old Norse ideas of law, order, and the chieftain's role as the sharpener of society. What is fascinating is that several other ceremonial whetstones have been found. Most famously, a spectacular one from the Sutton Hoo ship Burial in England, which is from an earlier Anglo-Saxon period, but shows the same idea was present. Another was found in a Viking grave at Klinta in Norway. They are all different, but they all share the same features. They are made of high-quality stone, they are elaborately carved, and they are unused. The Seton Carew scepter tells us a secret about Viking power. We often think of Viking leaders only in terms of their weapons, their swords, axes, and spears. We picture them as violent raiders, but this object shows a different side. It shows that they also saw themselves as lawgivers and judges. Their authority was not just based on brute force, it was also based on the idea of justice and social order. For the man who owned this scepter, the ultimate symbol of his power was not an object that could take a life, but one that represented the creation of a well-ordered world. Number 8. They hedged their bets with the gods. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, if you were a silversmith in a bustling Viking trading town like Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden, you would have a diverse clientele. People came from all over with different beliefs and different needs, and you would cater to all of them. On any given day, you might be making a delicate silver cross for the wife of a newly converted chieftain. At the same time, you would be casting small, powerful amulets in the shape of a hammer for a warrior who still put his trust in Thor. This is not speculation. It is exactly what archaeologists have found. In workshops and graves from this period, we find the symbols of the two religions lying side by side. Most common are the Thor's hammer pendants, known as Mjolnir amulets. Dozens of these have been found across the Viking world. They are often made of silver or iron and were worn on a necklace. They were a personal statement of faith and a call for protection from the strongest of the gods. But what is most revealing are the molds used to make them. In one find from Trend in Denmark, archaeologists discovered a soapstone mold. On one side was a mold for casting a cross, on the other side was a mold for casting a Thor's hammer. And it may even have had a third side for casting an ingot, a bar of raw silver. The person who used this mold sometime in the 10th century was a practical craftsman. He was not a theologian, he was a businessman. He had customers who wanted crosses and customers who wanted hammers. So he made both. His mold is a perfect snapshot of a society in religious flux. It shows that these two symbols, which we see as representing opposing forces, were being produced and worn in the same communities at the same time. But it goes deeper than that. Some people didn't choose one or the other. They chose both. Graves have been found where a person was buried wearing both a cross and a Thor's hammer. Why would they do this? It was not out of confusion. It was a form of spiritual insurance. The world was a dangerous and uncertain place. You needed all the help you could get. For a Viking sailor setting out on a long voyage, it made perfect sense. The Christian priests told him that their god was all-powerful. This new god seemed very effective for the southern kings and emperors. So, wearing a cross was a good idea. But he had grown up with stories of Thor, the god who controlled the winds and the waves, who fought the sea serpent. Why would you want to offend him? It was much safer to honor both. You would wear the cross to appeal to the new power, and the hammer to keep the old power on your side. It was a way of hedging your bets. This mixing of beliefs is called syncretism. It is very common when one religion is replacing another. People do not just drop their old worldview overnight. They blend the new with the old. They find ways to make them fit together. They might have seen Jesus as another powerful god, a new addition to the pantheon rather than a replacement for it. He could be worshipped alongside Thor and Odin. The Christian missionaries, of course, did not see it this way. For them, there was only one god, and the old gods were devils. But for the average person, this black and white view was not very practical. The story of the silversmith with his double-sided mold is the story of this practicality. He was supplying a demand. And the demand was for protection, in whatever form it took. The final generation of pagans did not live in a world that was neatly divided into pagan and Christian. They lived in a messy, overlapping world of old and new ideas. Many of them navigated this world by holding onto both, hoping that between the cross and the hammer, they would be safe. Number 7, conversion was a political announcement carved in stone. In the heart of Denmark, in the town of Jelling, stand two of the most important runestones in Europe. The smaller, older stone was raised by King Gorm the Old in memory of his wife Thyra, but it is the larger stone that tells the story of the end of pagan Denmark. This stone was raised by Gorm's son, King Harald Bluetooth, around the year 965. It is a massive, three-sided monument covered in intricate carvings and runes. It is often called Denmark's baptismal certificate. On one side is a carving of a great beast, a lion intertwined with a serpent. On another is the oldest image of Christ found in Scandinavia, a figure with outstretched arms caught in what looks like a pattern of branches. And on the third side, the main face, is the inscription. The runes read, King Haraldr ordered this monument made in memory of Gormr, his father, and in memory of Thyr, his mother, that Haraldr, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This last phrase is the crucial one, and made the Danes Christian. This is a bold public declaration. It is a king announcing a fundamental change in the identity of his people. But what did it really mean? Did it mean that on a certain day, every Dane suddenly abandoned the old gods and embraced the new faith? Almost certainly not. The conversion of a whole country is a long and complicated process. The grave of the Fyrkat Volva, with her shamanic tools, dates from 15 years after this stone was erected. Clearly, pagan practices continued. So what Harald was doing was political. He was making a statement, not just to his own people, but to the powerful Christian empire to the south, the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the Ottonian emperors. The emperors saw the pagan Danes as a threat and a target for conversion, which often went hand in hand with conquest. By declaring himself and his kingdom Christian, Harald was changing his international status. He was joining the club of European Christian monarchs. He was making himself an equal to the emperor, not a target. It was a brilliant act of diplomacy. The story of a man living in Denmark in 965 helps us understand this. Let's call him Bjorn, a landowner who owes allegiance to King Harald. For his entire life, he has followed the old ways. He has made offerings to Frey for his crops and to Thor for protection. He has attended the great feasts and sacrifices. Then, one day, he hears news from Jelling. The king has put up a massive stone. The stone says they are all Christian now. What does this mean for Bjorn? At first, probably not much changes in his daily life. He might still quietly leave a bowl of porridge for the household spirits. His wife might still use old charms to protect their children from sickness. But the public rituals will start to change. The king's priests will travel through the land. They will tell people to be baptized. They will build small wooden churches. The great public blots, the sacrifices led by the chieftains, will be discouraged and eventually forbidden. And Bjorn will see the stone itself. It is a huge and impressive object carved by the best artists and painted in bright colors. The image of the new god Christ is powerful. He is shown not as a suffering victim on a cross, but as a strong, triumphant ruler entangled in the branches of the world tree, Yggdrasil. This was a way of making the new god understandable to a Viking audience. He is portrayed as a powerful king, just like Harald. The gelling stone did not magically make every Dane a devout Christian overnight, but it marked the point of no return. It was a declaration from the very top of society that the official religion of the kingdom was now Christianity. It was the moment the tide officially turned. From this point on, to be a pagan was to be in opposition to the king. The stone tells us that the conversion of Scandinavia was often a top-down affair, driven by the political needs of its rulers. For King Harald, making the Danes Christian was a way to win for himself all of Denmark and Norway, a way to consolidate his power and secure his kingdom's place in the wider world. Number 6, their gods were part of a global collection. In the 1950s, archaeologists were excavating a Viking Age settlement on the island of Helgö in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. This was a major workshop and trading center that flourished for centuries, and the remains of one of the workshops among the broken pieces of molds for making jewelry and other local craft items, they found something that made no sense. It was a small bronze statue of a seated figure. The figure was calm and meditative. It was a Buddha. Scientific analysis showed that the statue was made in the Kashmir region of northern India in the 6th century. How did a 6th century Indian Buddha statue end up in an 8th or 9th century workshop in the middle of Sweden? It had traveled over 5,000 kilometers, a journey that would have taken it along the Silk Road, through the river systems of Russia and across the Baltic Sea. It was a testament to the incredible reach of the Vikings' trade networks. But the real secret the Helgö Buddha tells us is not about trade. It is about how the final generation of pagans saw the world. The man who owned this statue, a craftsman living on Helgö around the year 850, would have had no idea what it was. He would not have known about Buddhism. He would not have known the story of Siddhartha Gautama. To him, this was just a small, exotic figure of a person or a god from a faraway land. So what did he do with it? He kept it. It was found in his workshop, a place of creation and craft. It was not in a grave, so it wasn't a personal possession he wanted to take to the afterlife. It was part of his working life. It is possible he saw it as a powerful object. Perhaps he thought it was a representation of one of his own gods, or maybe a local spirit, a Tomte or a Nis. Or perhaps he simply thought it was a lucky charm, an object from a distant, magical land that brought good fortune to his work. And this is part of a larger pattern. Vikings collected strange and exotic objects. In their graves we find Irish Christian croziers broken up and repurposed as personal ornaments. We find Frankish sword hilts and Anglo-Saxon book mounts. We find coins from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad with Arabic script declaring there is no God but Allah. They did not seem to see these objects as being in conflict with their own beliefs. They did not smash the Christian croziers because they came from a rival religion. Instead, they took them apart and incorporated their beautiful designs into their own jewelry. They used the Arabic coins, the dirhams, not just as money, but as decoration prized for the purity of their silver and their intricate patterns. The Helgö Buddha is the ultimate example of this. It suggests that the Viking pagan worldview was open and inclusive. It was not a rigid, dogmatic religion with a strict set of rules about what was holy and what was not. Instead, it was a system that could absorb new things. A Viking trader might see a new god in a foreign land and think, that seems like a powerful one. It might be useful to make a small offering to him, just in case. This helps explain how they approached Christianity in the beginning. For many, the Christian god was not the one and only god. He was just a new god, the god of the Southerners, and he seemed to be very powerful given the wealth and success of the Christian kingdoms. So it made sense to add him to the existing pantheon. You could build a church for him, but that didn't mean you had to tear down the sacred grove where you made offerings to Thor. The craftsman on Helgö with his little bronze Buddha on his workbench was not a Buddhist. He was a Norse pagan, but His world was big enough to include a strange, calm god from India. He saw it not as a religious threat, but as another small piece of the vast, mysterious, and powerful world that his people were exploring. Number 5, conversion was often violent. We often like to think of religious conversion as a peaceful process of persuasion and personal choice. Missionaries arrive, they preach, and people, convinced by the new message, slowly adopt the new faith. This did happen sometimes in the Viking Age, but very often it happened another way. It was violent, coercive, and brutal. The story of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway is a stark reminder of this. Olaf Tryggvason ruled Norway for just 5 years, from 995 to 1000. He was a Viking warrior who had converted to Christianity while abroad. When he returned to Norway and seized the throne, he was determined to make his entire kingdom Christian. He did not rely on gentle persuasion. He used force. Snorri Sturluson, in the Heimskringla, tells many stories of Olaf's method. These stories were written down long after the events, but they capture the reputation Olaf had as a ruthless converter. One story tells of a meeting Olaf had with the powerful chieftains of the Trondelag region, the same area that had resisted King Hakon the Good years before. The chieftains were still staunchly pagan. Their leader was a man named Jarnskegi, or Iron Beard. They demanded that Olaf make a sacrifice to their gods, as was tradition. Olaf agreed, but he had a plan. He told the chieftains to go into the temple to prepare the sacrifice. While they were inside, Olaf and his men went in as well, but instead of making an offering, Olaf took an axe and smashed the statue of Thor, the most important god in the temple. The other gods were also torn down by his men. When the chieftains saw their gods being destroyed, they were enraged. Jarnskegi rushed at the king, but one of Olaf's men killed him. With their leader dead and their gods broken on the floor, the chieftains' resistance collapsed. Olaf gave them a choice, be baptized or die. They chose baptism. Another story shows his cruelty. There was a group of cider practitioners, male sorcerers, who resisted him. Olaf invited them to a feast on a remote island. Once they were all drunk and asleep in the hall, he had the doors barred and the building set on fire. They all burned to death. Olaf's methods were extreme, even by the standards of the time. He saw paganism not just as a different belief system, but as an evil that had to be stamped out by any means necessary. For him, smashing an idol was not just breaking a piece of wood. It was a direct challenge to the power of the god it represented. It was a way of showing people that their gods were helpless, that they could not even protect their own images from a Christian king with an axe. Imagine being a farmer in one of the remote fjords of Norway around the year 998. Your family has worshipped the same gods in the same sacred places for as long as anyone can remember. One day, the king's ships arrive in your fjord. The king himself, Olaf Tryggvason, comes ashore with his armed retinue. He tells you, and your neighbors, that you must give up your gods. You must be baptized in the name of a new god from the south. If you refuse, the consequences are severe. Snorri tells of Olaf torturing and killing those who held out. He was not there to debate theology, he was there to enforce his will. For the ordinary person, this was not a free choice. It was a command backed by the threat of violence. Many would have accepted baptism simply to save their own lives and the lives of their families. They might have gone through the motions of the Christian ritual, but in their hearts they may have held on to the old beliefs. The story of Olaf Tryggvason's violent conversion campaign is a crucial part of the history of the final pagan generation. It tells us that the end of the old ways was not always a quiet fading away. It was often a loud, bloody, and traumatic event forced upon people by kings who believed they were doing God's work with a sword in their hand. Number 4, an entire nation converted to avoid a civil war. The conversion of Iceland is one of the most unusual stories in the entire Viking world. It did not happen because of a conquering king or a violent missionary campaign. It happened because of a political decision made at a specific time and place to prevent the country from tearing itself apart. The year was 1000. The place was the Althing, the National Assembly of Iceland. Iceland was a unique place. It had been settled by Norsemen, mostly from Norway, in the late 9th century. They had created a new kind of society, a commonwealth without a king. Their power rested with a group of chieftains called Godar. They met every summer at the Althing to make laws, settle disputes, and hold court. The system was a delicate balance of power. By the late 10th century, Christian missionaries, many sent by the aggressive King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, had been active in Iceland. They had converted some important families, but many of the most powerful chieftains remained staunchly pagan. The country was dividing into two hostile camps. Sagas tell of skirmishes and insults between the two factions. At the Althing of the year 1000, the situation reached a crisis point. The Christian and pagan factions came to the assembly armed and ready to fight. It looked like a civil war was about to begin. According to the accounts in the Islandingabok, the Book of the Icelanders, written by Ari the Wise about a century later, the leaders of both sides realized that a fight would destroy their society. They agreed to arbitration. They turned to one man to make a decision for everyone. That man was the current law speaker, the man whose job it was to recite the law at the Althing. His name was Thorgeir Thorkelson, and he was a pagan chieftain from Leosavatn. Thorgeir accepted the difficult task. He retreated to his tent. For a full day and a night, he lay down and covered himself with a cloak, a traditional way of meditating or seeking inspiration. No one disturbed him. When he emerged, he had a solution. He went before the assembled crowd at the Law Rock and gave his speech. He argued that the most important thing was for the Icelanders to have one law and one faith. A nation divided against itself could not survive. Therefore, he decreed all Icelanders should be baptized and become Christian. This was his main ruling. The Christian faction was pleased, but then he added a series of compromises designed to placate the pagans. First, he said that people could continue to expose unwanted newborn infants, a traditional practice that the church opposed. Second, they could continue to eat horse meat, which was associated with pagan sacrifices and forbidden by the church. And third, and most importantly, people would be allowed to sacrifice to the old gods in private. As long as there were no witnesses, it would not be against the law. This was an extraordinary compromise. In public, Iceland would be a Christian nation, but in the privacy of one's own home, the old ways could continue. The deal was accepted. The two sides laid down their arms. Civil war was averted. People went down to the river to be baptized. The story goes that Thorgeir Thorkelson himself, after returning home, took the idols of his gods from his farm and threw them into a nearby waterfall, which is now called Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods. The story of the Icelandic conversion reveals a deep secret about the mindset of this last pagan generation. For Thorgeir and, the other chieftains, social order and the unity of their country were more important than any specific religious doctrine. Their decision was pragmatic and political, not theological. They chose the solution that would cause the least disruption. And the compromise shows that they saw a distinction between public religion and private belief. Publicly, they would all be Christian to maintain peace and good relations with Christian Europe, especially Norway. But privately, a man could still believe what he wanted for at least a generation or two after the year 1000. It is likely that many Icelanders did just that. They were officially Christian, but they still whispered the names of Odin and Frey and made small offerings in secret, holding on to the old world while navigating the demands of the new one. Number 3, they encountered a Christianity as old as their own gods. So when the first Viking raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in Northumbria in 793, they were not just attacking a defenseless settlement. They were attacking a center of a vibrant and long-established Christian culture. We often think of the Vikings as pagans clashing with a new Christian world. But in places like England and Ireland, the Christianity they encountered was already centuries old, with its own deep roots and powerful traditions. The Coppergate helmet is a physical piece of this older world that the Vikings stepped into. It was found in York in 1982 during excavations in an area called Coppergate. York, which the Vikings called Jorvik, became the capital of their kingdom in northern England. The helmet is one of only a handful of helmets ever found from this period in Europe. It is a masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon metalwork made around the year 760, more than a century before the Vikings established their rule in the city. It is a high-status warrior's helmet made of iron and decorated with brass. It has cheek guards and a mail curtain to protect the neck. Most strikingly, it has a brass nasal guard that forms part of a design of two intertwined animals. But the most important feature is a small inscription on one of the brass strips that runs over the crest of the helmet. The inscription is in Latin and reads in nomen DNI Nostri IHV SCS SPS DI ET Omnibus Decem's Amen Osher XPI. A likely translation is, "In the name of our Lord Jesus, the Holy Spirit, God, and all, we pray. Amen. Osher, Christ." This is an explicitly Christian prayer. It was placed on a warrior's helmet, an object of violence, to call for God's protection in battle. The man who wore this helmet, a Northumbrian nobleman named Osher, went into combat with the name of Jesus on his head. When the Vikings conquered York in 866, this helmet was already an antique. It was 100 years old. We do not know what happened to it. It was found in a pit lined with wood, which may have been a well. It was not in a grave. Perhaps it was hidden for safekeeping during the chaos of the Viking invasion and never recovered. Or perhaps it was found by a Viking warrior who lived in Jorvik in the 10th century. Let us imagine that story. A Viking in Jorvik, maybe a man named Kettle, is digging a well in his backyard. His shovel hits something hard. He pulls it out of the mud. It is a helmet, old but magnificent. He cleans it off and sees the strange designs and the writing. He cannot read the Latin, but he might recognize the cross symbol for Christ XPI. He would know this was a helmet from the English people who lived here before his grandfathers came. And he would know it was from a Christian. By the mid-10th century, the Vikings of Jorvik were in the process of converting to Christianity themselves. They were minting coins with the names of Saint Peter on them. The kings of Jorvik were being baptized. For a man like Kettle, this helmet would be a powerful object. It was a relic from the past, a symbol of the very faith that was now becoming his own. It was not a foreign alien thing. It was part of the history of the land he now called home. The secret the Coppergate helmet reveals is that the religious landscape the Vikings entered was not empty. They did not just bring their gods to a new place. They encountered established religions, particularly the well-organized and wealthy Celtic and Anglo-Saxon churches. Over time, there was a process of exchange and assimilation. The Vikings who settled in England became Christianized relatively quickly within a few generations. They started giving their children Christian names. They were buried in Christian cemeteries. This helmet shows that the Christianity they adopted was not a brand new import from the continent. It was a local version of the faith that had been in Britain for centuries. It was the faith of the powerful Anglo-Saxon lords like Osher, a faith that was strong enough to be inscribed on their war gear. For the final generation of pagans in the Danelaw, their conversion was not just an adoption of a new religion, but an integration into the older Christian culture of the land they had conquered. Number 2, their buried treasure was a prayer to a world in chaos. In 2011, a man with a metal detector was searching a field in Silverdale, Lancashire in northwestern England. He got a strong signal and started to dig. What he found became one of the most important Viking hoards ever discovered in the UK. Of the Silverdale hoard, as it is now known, was a collection of over 200 silver items packed tightly into a lead container and buried in the ground sometime around the year 900. The hoard contained a mix of objects. There were 27 coins. These came from all over the Viking world and beyond. There were Anglo-Saxon coins from Wessex and Mercia. There were coins from the territory of the Danish king Guthrum in East Anglia. There were Carolingian coins from what is now France, and there were Kufit coins from the Islamic world, probably from Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. The hoard also contained 10 arm rings, many of them beautifully decorated, some of them of a type known as hacksilver, meaning they were chopped into pieces to be used as currency by weight. There were also brooches, rings, and small silver ingots. The person who buried this treasure was clearly wealthy and well-connected. He was part of the vast network of trade, raiding, and tribute that defined the Viking Age. The coins from Baghdad and the arm rings from Ireland found in a field in Lancashire show how global this world was. But the most important question about any hoard is not what is in it, but why it was buried. Hoards are buried for two main reasons. One is for safekeeping. You bury your wealth in a secret spot when you are afraid of attack or when you have to leave in a hurry. You fully intend to come back and dig it up later. The other reason is ritual. You bury the treasure as a gift or an offering to the gods, perhaps to thank them for a victory or to ask for their favor in the future. With a ritual hoard, you never intend to recover it. The Silverdale hoard was probably buried for the first reason. The early 10th century was a time of intense conflict in this part of England. The Anglo-Saxons of Wessex, under the children of Alfred the Great, were pushing north, trying to reconquer the Danelaw. The Norse settlers who had come over from Ireland were being expelled from Dublin and were looking for new lands in northern England. It was a violent and uncertain time. The man who buried the Silverdale hoard was likely a Viking leader living in this chaotic world. He heard that an army was coming. He gathered his portable wealth, his life savings, and buried it, marking the spot carefully. He intended to come back for it, but he never did. He was probably killed in the fighting that followed. The hoard is a secret message from this man. It tells us about the sheer precariousness of life. Even for a wealthy and powerful individual, everything could be lost in an instant. The world was unstable. His wealth, gathered from across the known world, could not protect him from a local war. But there is a deeper, more pagan secret here as well. The act of burying treasure, even just for safekeeping, has a ritual element. You are entrusting your wealth to the earth. You are asking the land spirits, the land vitir, to guard it for you. The boundary between a savings account and a religious offering could be very thin. In a world governed by fate, by word, burying your treasure was an act of hope. It was a prayer that the chaos would pass, that you would survive, and that the gods or the spirits of the land would keep your wealth safe until you could return. The man who buried the Silverdale hoard was almost certainly a pagan. The date is too early for the local Norse population to have been Christianized. His worldview was shaped by the old gods and the old ideas about fate. He saw the world as a place of struggle where a man's fortune could turn in a moment. His hoard, lying in the ground for over 1,000 years, is a silent testament to that reality. It is the story of a life lived on the edge and a final, desperate attempt to secure a future that never came. Number 1. The grandest funerals were a journey, not an end. In the year 834, 2 women were laid to rest in a magnificent Viking ship buried under a great mound of earth at Oseberg, Norway. This was one of the most spectacular archaeological finds ever made. The ship itself was a work of art, a 21-meter-long vessel carved with intricate animal designs. The burial chamber was filled with treasures, beds, tapestries, a richly decorated cart, sledges, chests, and the remains of 15 horses, 4 dogs, and an ox. For a long time, it was assumed that the older of the 2 women was a great queen or priestess, and the younger woman was her slave, sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. But recent scientific analysis has told a new, more complex and more human story. An examination of the skeletons revealed that the older woman, who was between 70 and 80 years old, had suffered from advanced cancer. It was likely her terminal illness that led to the preparations for this incredibly elaborate funeral. She was clearly a person of immense importance. The younger woman was about 50 years old. Her skeleton showed no signs of a violent death. She was not a slave sacrificed at the last minute. She was also a high-status woman, buried with respect. They may have been relatives, a queen and her trusted companion who died around the same time. The Oseberg burial took place early in the Viking Age, 200 years before the final generation of pagans. But the memory of such funerals, the stories of these great ship burials for the legendary kings and queens of the past, would have been a powerful part of the cultural landscape for those later Vikings. These were the funerals of their ancestors, the gold standard for a glorious death. The secret of the Oseberg burial, and others like it, is what it tells us about the pagan conception of the afterlife. For these people, death was not an end. It was a journey, and you needed to be well equipped for that journey. The ship was not just a coffin, it was a vehicle to transport the dead to the other world, be it Valhalla, Folkvanger, or Hell. All the items in the grave, the beds to sleep on, the cart to ride in, the food, the animals were provisions for this voyage. The funeral itself would have been a massive public event, a piece of theater that affirmed the power of the dead leader's family and the continuity of their community. It would have taken months to prepare. The ship had to be hauled ashore. The burial chamber had to be built. The mound had to be constructed. It was a huge investment of resources and labor. This was not something done out of mere sentiment. It was a religious and political necessity. It was about ensuring the dead made their journey successfully so they would not linger as ghosts. And it was about demonstrating the power and wealth of the living. Now, imagine a man living in the year 1050, the same year the sorcerer of Clinta was buried. This man's parents or grandparents were among the first in his family to be buried in the Christian way. They were wrapped in a simple shroud and placed in a grave in the new churchyard, their bodies oriented east to west, awaiting the resurrection on Judgment Day. There were no grave goods, there was no ship, there was no sacrificed horse. He would have heard the stories of the old days, the tales of the great mound burials, like Oseberg. He might have walked past those ancient mounds, huge man-made hills that dominated the landscape. He would have known that inside them were kings and queens sailing into the afterlife on their ships, surrounded by their treasures. Compared to that, the new Christian burial must have seemed stark, simple, and perhaps a little frightening. What had been lost? The grandeur was gone. The sense of a physical journey was gone. The direct connection to the world of the living through the great visible mound was gone. The Christian promise was of a spiritual paradise, but the old pagan way had offered a much more tangible, and in some ways more magnificent vision of the afterlife. The story of the Oseberg women, filtered down through 2 centuries of oral tradition, would have been a powerful reminder to the last pagan generation of what their cosmology was giving up. The ship in the earth was the ultimate statement of their ancestors' worldview. It was a belief that the journey after death was real, physical, and required the best that life had to offer. It was a world of epic funerals and voyages into the unknown, a world that was being replaced by the quiet, humble hope of a churchyard grave.